This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay, so I'd like to invite questions from the floor now. Okay, so we start here.
This is a question for JD, and it was about, it references some of the things that came up actually in one of the earlier sessions. And it was about the sort of official and non-official. Some of the objects you've shown are clearly kind of what you might call official. They're produced by governments or institutions, but you obviously have even the thing you showed at the end, sort of wooden carvings, which would have been produced by indigenous communities, might have been produced as part of a protest. Obviously in an archive, particularly a kind of national archive, say the National Archives has, the archives of the government, and the unofficial documents might be held elsewhere. They're incredibly important as part of the bigger picture, but they might not be in that institution. What's the dividing line with the British Museum? It clearly has both the official and unofficial voice, which is a great thing. How do you curate those? Do you curate them differently? Do you select them differently? How do you kind of manage both those voices in one collection?
I've not actually had it phrased that way before, but it's quite an interesting way. For me, the issue, I would have thought, I'm just turning to Katie, who can nod. The issue at the British Museum is more whether the object is nice.
Maybe I'll disagree with you in a minute.
That there's a big distinction, if you like, between what might be described as the art object, which may often be commissioned by those in power and the elite, and the bog standard other objects in the collection. I don't think we would, in a sense, I don't think we would curate the official object different from the unofficial object. We would be, I think, aware of it being official in terms of how that, the imagery which that object is there to convey, but I wouldn't want to say we would do it differently. I think the challenge is always there's often a bias towards the nice, and so one of the questions, a critical question you could ask about history of the 100 objects is it is rather an elite selection of objects. So that's because nice objects tend to have come to the fore. And one of the challenges in getting that collection done was to make sure that there were some non-elite objects there, and we may not have got enough in.
Just to add to that, I used to be one of the curators in the coin department at the museum, so did quite actively collect stuff that was defaced or had things stamped across it or stamped into it, which were that unofficial response. And those objects are fantastic because they kind of give you both sides of the story. One of them was in the history of the world, the suffragette penny, which had votes for women stamped across the king's head. And an interesting footnote to that is that we have inadvertently spawned a market for fakes on eBay. Yours for 80 quid, a penny stamped with WSPU, because in the programme, I think we said we couldn't be sure about the link to the WSPU, but it was their slogan. And now you can, because it's yours on eBay. So I think there's a caution there for this attempt to do history through objects, is you create new objects in doing it.
Is it, sorry, yeah, you're in front of Maxine. No. Maxine.
This is a question for Margot, and I thought it was really interesting how English is the English country home, because I think it really forces us to re-examine who we think we are nationally, and it really is a big business, isn't it, which you sort of hinted at by mentioning downtown. But I just wondered, to what extent did you find that there might have been some resistance from some of the families of these homes? Because, especially now in terms of preservation, etc., inviting people to come to see your home and having to put together a narrative that is quite people-friendly, but perhaps you sort of hinted that there were contested histories here. So were there any families that didn't want to, possibly take part, or are there any other challenges that you met during the course of the project?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I guess I was very worried when we began that we would run into a lot of roadblocks about people who were writing their own family history and were concerned about the syphilitic grandfather or whatever, to refer back to a comment made earlier, and also very worried about houses where they didn't want the history to be known. I've been somewhat surprised. I think that I think family historians that I have encountered have been a lot more open to thinking broadly about and not feeling personally responsible for their great-great-grandfather's, doings. The greater resistance I think we've encountered has been structural in, for example, the National Trust, and structural in media. So let me start with the National Trust and then I'll move to media. And structural in the media isn't probably the right phrase. I'll try and rephrase that. Osterley Park, which is a National Trust property, has an absolutely inspired head of collections and house curator who was really interested and up for telling different stories about Osterley. Very open to that. And very keen to get this local South Asian British community, which uses the park, the garden, all the time, into the house and connecting with the house. So there we found that the Trust very, very open. But the Trust's way of approaching the house is to pick a particular time period and to lock onto that particular time period as the story that they're going to tell. So Sir Francis Sykes' house, Basildon Park in Berkshire, that is a company house, and you can't really tell a proper history of that house unless you tell a company story. But Basildon, the Trust has fixed on the 1950s, and Lord and Lady Iliff as the way that house's story will be told. So we have to have more inventive ways in cultural institutions of being able to say, there are 19 different stories about this house, and if we have evidence on 9 of them, at least we're going to make all 9 available, even if we're focusing on the house in the 1950s. And I think that there is both in the media, and I'll come to the media in a moment, and in cultural institutions, and I think in universities, I think we underestimate the ability of people who are interested in history to actually deal with ambiguity, deal with complexity. I mean, they're people, they deal with ambiguity and complexity in their daily lives. They can probably handle it in their history. So I think that part of the dumbing down of history that is done, and I'm now going to move on to the media, needs to be disrupted. I did a piece which I really now regret having done, given what they did to it, in program Britain's Hidden Houses, something like that. And they picked an East India Company house that was on the Kentish coast. It was an East India Company captain. And they wanted to tell the story of this house, and why was it in Kent, and why did this man not bring his wife back, his mixed-race wife back with him from India to this house. And it turned out I knew quite a lot about the wife of this person, completely unrelated research, knew nothing about the house until they told me about it. But the wife I knew quite a lot about, having worked on Indian domestic slavery. And she happened to be one of many Indo-Portuguese mixed-raced women who married into the company community, often serially married company captains and company men. She and the other Indo-Portuguese women of this community were substantial domestic slave owners. And you can pick this up in their wills because they leave their slaves either in a free state or in a bonded state to their lady friends. So I knew quite a lot about this woman, and we knew a lot about her as a slaveholder. And the producer for this piece, with whom I was working, was an East India Company at Home project associate. And he was really keen. How can we, tell this story of this house in Kent and link it together with domestic slavery in India? We thought this was great. And we filmed it. We had a really good narrative line, and they chopped it entirely out of what they publicized. And I think the basic reason was, well, this isn't a history about slavery. This is history about houses. So houses are over here and slavery is over there. So those obstacles, I don't think those are so much located in local and family history communities as they're located in bigger organizations like the BBC. You know, and they're structured into the National Trust in ways that are to do with having limited resources and not feeling that you can tell the multiple histories of the house. So making decisions that you're only going to tell the story of the house in this period. And it's very hard to tell a global history if you pick a particular decade, because a global history stretches not just across space, but across time.
Maxine.
I just have one question for Margot and one for Katie. I hope everybody remembers Margot's website. I was just struck by one of the images that kept flashing by, which was that building in Carnoustie,
Yeah.
which looks like Fort St. David. I assume it's an, reconstruction of an East India Company factory, warehouse. I just wonder if you could tell us when it was built, and it just seems interesting that a merchant or whatever coming back would create a building like this. You could never conceive of a cotton manufacturer building a house to resemble the mill where he made his money. So that was one for, and I just wonder, it's something that hasn't come out through the day. I'm interested in, sort of the people, a lot of the people that we're talking about, their ideas of their national identities, since so many of these archives are national archives that we've been discussing, and those merchants those Indian merchants that Katie has talked about, resisting these fixing of the exchange rates on all these other coins, etc. Just who did they perceive themselves as? How kind of a modern way of putting it, I guess, is how many passports did they have? And because it does seem to me that a lot of these people, these national boundaries, they aren't really what they're dealing in at all.
Do you want to start with national boundaries?
Sure. It's a very good point, and I kind of use Indian as a very bad shorthand for a whole series of different groups. One thing I think is really interesting is from slightly later in the 19th century, there's evidence that it's in many ways a very practical kind of business-minded decision. So if there's a legal dispute, you can place yourself under the Sultan's jurisdiction or under the British consul's jurisdiction or under the French consul's jurisdiction, depending on who you think will help your case. So there's something very, very fluid about national identity. And in terms of that period, in the kind of third quarter of the 19th century, what I've really been trying to do is sort of look at it without assuming what we know to have been the end result in the 1890s, right? So this is a period when the British are politically influential, but it isn't anywhere near a kind of done deal yet that they will become the colonial power. And so I think there's a kind of issue of terminology and sort of trying to find ways of describing groups of people in a 20-minute presentation. But actually, I try as much as possible to sort of think about it in those very fluid terms without being kind of imperial in the framework that gets used for it, because it just wasn't like that. There's all this kind of moving around and shifting of allegiances and all that going on.
Yeah, thanks. Just a couple of comments about the Carnoustie and the other examples of the ways in which architectural forms and practices that come from elsewhere then become a part of the local area in Scotland, England and Wales. We haven't done a lot with that, but it strikes me that it appears, now this is I have no statistical basis for what I'm about to say, but I also believe it's probably true. It appears to us that it is more in the border regions at the penumbra of Britain that these borrowings of Indian architectural forms seem to be more common. than they are in Hertfordshire and Berkshire and places where you've got scads of retired East India Company servants. Those English heartland company families seem to be more concerned to reinscribe an English kind of architectural form. But one of the case studies that also flits across the screen is a series of completely inexplicable Chinese Chippendale staircases that pop up in northeast Wales. And it seems to be there's a regional aesthetic that borrows the Indian global aesthetic more freely and more willingly than necessarily happens closer to London. And I think that one of the themes that I've noticed coming out in what people have said, and I think it's a really important development within global history, is the importance of the local. And that relationship between the local and the global, and it's not that the global elides and erases the local, but it often provides a site for rethinking the local identity. So that's a somewhat inadequate answer to your very interesting question.
Thank you. We've got about just under 5 minutes left, if anybody would like. Okay, so we've got 2 questions. Eureka, on this side. Yeah, can you put your hand up again?
Thank you. Thank you for all those fascinating papers. My name is Eureka Henrich. I'm from King's College, and I'm one of these funny historians who really likes objects as well as documents. And I think all of your papers made that connection, but earlier in the day we've had some people calling for historians to see documents as objects. And I'm wondering if perhaps that means that historians should be looking at museums as archives. And I was wondering if you'd like to comment perhaps on the relationship between academic historians in particular and museums, and using museums as resources for their research, whether there is a good relationship there and perhaps how it's changing.
Was that a question for the panel? Or yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay.
JD.
Thank you. I think certainly a lot of people are starting to talk about the physicality of documents and the physicality of books, and certainly I know book historians are really taking this forward. And I think, for me, I think one of the benefits of that type of approach is that, I think as Margot has just said, object lives stretch over very, very long periods of time. So to take to think of a document as an object enables you to think about its lives and its afterlives and its second lives in the way in which it's being used and interpreted. In terms of the questions about academic historians using museums, I think there's been a lot more of it over the last few years in the UK. A lot of it, helped by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the shift towards impact. There's been a big push towards there. I think what actually I think holds it back, speaking as someone from the other side, is perhaps a reticence by historians to let themselves go. Perhaps a reticence also in a sense of, something Margot and I've talked about is, if you're new, I'm a prehistorian. I'm taught not to read documents. If you're brought up as an undergraduate historian and you're never exposed to object-based histories, will you even think about doing that when you come to do your PhD? And if you're lucky, you may stumble across an object which demands, and objects do this, objects demand you take them seriously. And if you fail to do that, you may not get sucked into objects.
Yeah, just 2 things to say to that. One of the questions I set master students on a theoretical course that addresses material culture is actually, in a way, the obverse of the one you've asked, and that is whether an object is a text. And I think that's a question we also have to ask. We've just introduced a new undergraduate course in which all first-year undergraduates in their first term have to grapple either with a physical space or with an object or with a document, an archival document. And I think that's really, really important for a rising generation, because one of the things that's quite striking when you teach undergraduates now is if you bring, as we can bring, thanks to a new teaching program at UCL, we can bring stuff from the museums or from the special collections into our seminar rooms, and they can put gloves on and handle it for the first time. And you can do it in a first-year class, a second-year class, a third-year class, anything. They'll just bring it in for you. And the first time I brought a logbook by Captain Cook into my class on New South Wales colonial history. I hadn't actually seen this object before. They traipsed it over from special collections, put gloves on everybody, and there we were looking at it. What struck the students most about it, and these are third-year undergraduate students, they kept on saying, you mean there's only one of this? This is the only one of this? Because they live in a digital universe where everything is infinitely replicable, and that was really, really interesting. But also when we flipped through it, I mean, it happened to be the only Captain Cook logbook that UCL has, and it happens to be about his Northern Atlantic voyages, not directly relevant, except we flip through to the final page, and there is a list of his Pacific, the Pacific Islanders that he met when in the Pacific, that he clearly written into this copy logbook. So again, if you didn't have the actual document, you couldn't see that Pacific bit of the history. But again, most surprising was just these students saying, you know, yeah, sure, but there are lots of these, aren't there? No, there's one in one place.
Katie, did you want to add?
Just to add one very small point to that, which is there's these amazing objects which are the things that demand attention, the things that are unique. But in terms of the museum as archive, there's also the collection as the unit of inquiry. So what does the collection as an assemblage? I mean, look at the prehistorian here, and there's a power to a collection of things, whether they're documents or objects, and what they tell you as a group, which I think is really crucial.
I think we'd better probably draw that to a close. I think we've got the roundtable starting straight away at 4 o'clock. But I suppose it's interesting, that last point, also just sort of connects to the first question as well, again, about the how those collections were amassed, and actually, and as somebody who does museum history, how the history of those people who were doing those decisions in the past also tells us another framework within which to investigate some of these very interesting and important questions. I'd like to thank the panel for 3 very lively and fascinating papers which have really drawn on many of the themes today, and I hope you join me in thanking them again.